Hi class, this is Dr. Heather Austin Robillard, and this lecture video is going to be over standardized tests. As we've seen in previous lecture slides, this is the culmination of the substance abuse evaluation. And so the reason we are going over standardized tests is because psychological evaluations, screenings, and assessments are typically one of the ways that we gather information. And so in order to gather information using these tools, we need to understand what standardized tests and how to interpret their scores. First, let's review a little bit about what we know about psychological tests. Measuring psychological variables like craving or motivation are how these tests are created. They can be used in different formats, including paper, pen. They can be more structured or computer assisted, or they could just be behavioral observations. Psychological tests tend to be more objective than others and are used as an actual tool for the interview rather than just the interview asking questions. They all have a score corresponding with an interpretation from that psychological test. And they are used in evaluation and screening assessments. Also seen in previous lecture slides, this lecture video will go over some certain important components that can be found in the ICRC licensing exams for LCDCs. For one, we will talk briefly about screening, brief intervention, and referrals for treatment. It goes over the task for selecting and administrating assessment instruments, gathering and assessing information, knowing and having knowledge about appropriate screening and assessment tools, screening and identifying outside of our scope of practice for substance abuse counselors and requiring referrals, the use of screening and instruments and assessment instruments, interpreting these results from the screening and assessment tools, and being able to integrate all the available information into a formal diagnosis. Interpretation of the results and integrating the information for determining an appropriate course of action. What you will be expected to do as a licensed chemical dependence counselor is being able to administer and score instruments as well as interpret the assessment instrument. In order to do this, we need to have a brief understanding of norms and statistics. As an LCDC, you will also need to know how to choose screening and assessment instruments for your clientele. And in order to do that, we need to have a brief understanding about reliability and validity of instruments. In your reading, it discussed the assumptions for different assessment tools. One assumption is that psychological traits and states do exist. These psychological traits and states can be quantified and measured. And test-related behavior tends to predict non-test behavior. Tests and techniques have strengths and weaknesses. We also know that there are various sources of error as part of the assessment process. And testing and assessment can be conducted in a fair and unbiased manner. And we do also know that testing does benefit society. When it comes to psychological tests and psychological constructs, constructs exist. Remember the assumption. The definition is the informed scientific concept or construct to describe or explain a specific behavior. They do tend to vary. There can be constructs of addiction or constructs of introversion versus extroversion. There can be constructs about craving or motivation. Traits are distinguishable, relatively enduring way in which one individual varies from one another. They do not necessarily manifest 100% of the time and sometimes can be situationally dependent. States are relatively less enduring and tend to happen regardless of the situation. So why is this important to standardize test? Well, standardized test is an assessment tool given to a group of subjects under the exact same environment and scored the exact same way. Why would they do this? This helps remove bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious bias. It can prevent how the environment impacts the results of a specific type of test, which is why it's called standardized. Standardized tests produce norms and statistical standards. A test cannot be standardized until the test is reliable, meaning it gives consistent results. It also needs to be valid, meaning it can be reproduced. With psychological tests, we tend to have latent variable models and psychological variables. Addiction, just like intelligence or extroversion, can't really be measured physically. So we can only infer these constructs through overt behavior, which is a latent variable, observable actions or product of one behavior. In psychological tests, your answer is the overt behavior. We can apply a numerical value to that overt behavior. A collection of these measures the construct. So for example, if the latent variable is addiction, we would measure it through several different items. Those items might be overt behaviors like using despite consequences, getting into legal trouble, withdraw, tolerance, and so on. So how do we use numbers to quantify a social reality? How do we make sense of these numbers? Well, first we need to understand the 4 levels of measurement. The levels of measurement include ordinal and nominal, which are discrete and discontinuous variables, and interval and ratio, which are considered continuous variables. Nominal level variables use numbers only to name or label. They only represent a category and actually don't have a value. The rules to be nominal mean they have to be mutually exclusive, meaning they can't be both, and they have to be exhaustive, so there has to be an end to it. An example of this are men and women, right? We label them either man or woman, they can't be both. Here are the issues with having nominal numbers. They are purely for description, they don't have any value. There's no more or less, one isn't better than the other. And we can't really do math with these numbers. And we can't really get the mean with these numbers. An ordinal level of measurement labels a category, like a name, and its rank. So it does represent somewhat of a value, but it does not indicate the magnitude of difference between that value. An example would be ranking marathon, who comes in first, who comes in second, who comes in third. Here are the issues with ordinal measurements. Although it gives us a name and a magnitude, it does not give us the exact difference between 2 points. The mathematical process is not applicable. We cannot add or subtract, and we cannot necessarily get the mean. With interval level of measurement, not only does it provide rank, but it also provides the distance between the entities. However, there is not an absolute 0 present. The measurement or the numbers are, however, also based on a construct as opposed to a physical distance. An example of this are different Likert scales or IQ. So as we can see, alcoholism is associated with a weak will. You can strongly disagree or strongly agree. There is a distance between these entities, but there's no actual 0. The ratio level of measurement provides a rank, distance between the entities, and has an absolute 0. It is mostly a physical distance. However, in social sciences statistics, interval and ratio tend to be irrelevant. So why do we need to know this? We need to know how you treat the numbers or the statistics depends on the nature of the number, for example, gender. What statistics do we use is also dependent on the levels of measurement. How we interpret the numbers or the scoring of the test depends on how the numbers are used.